Over 1,000 years ago, a man walked alone through the mountains of Japan. His name was Kukai, but the world would come to know him as Kōbō Daishi, the Great Master. It is said that, on his last journey to Mount Koya, he left behind a mysterious teaching, a warning that would echo through the centuries. If you do not abandon this, you will be unhappy forever. But what is this? Monks have spent generations trying to unravel this message. Some believed he was speaking of desire, while others said it was the fear of death. Yet, there were those who believed in something deeper, something that could only be understood by those willing to look beyond the words. And then, a secret emerged. Among the ancient manuscripts kept in the temples, a forgotten story began to be whispered through the hallways, the tale of a young monk who would discover the true meaning of Kōbō Daishi's warning. What he found changed his life forever, and perhaps it can change yours as well. Now, prepare yourself, because this journey begins now. In the silent mountains of Shikoku, hidden among ancient trees and moss-covered temples, lived a young monk named Ryosen. Since childhood, he had heard stories about Kōbō Daishi and his teachings, but deep in his heart, he felt that something was missing. The sutras he read seemed incomplete. The prayers he recited did not answer the questions that tormented him. One morning, while organizing the temple archives, Ryosen stumbled upon something unusual, an old scroll hidden at the bottom of a wooden drawer worn thin by time. The yellowed paper was brittle, its edges burned as if someone had attempted to destroy it. His hands trembled as he opened the document and saw the characters written in faded ink. It was a message from Kōbō Daishi. If you do not abandon this, you will be unhappy forever. But unlike the known versions, this one contained something more. Just below the phrase, there was an additional line. But he who manages to leave this behind will find true freedom. Ryosen's heart raced. That was the missing piece. For centuries, monks had studied Kukai's warning, yet they had never mentioned this ending. The answer he sought so desperately might be right there. But to his frustration, the last line was erased. What was to be abandoned, and how could he attain that freedom? For days, he rummaged through the temple archives, questioned the older monks, tried to restore the scroll, but all was in vain. No other clues, no explanations. There was only one option left. He would have to discover the answer himself. And so he made a decision. If there was a place where this mystery could be unraveled, that place was Mount Koya, where Kōbō Daishi rested in eternal meditation. It was a long and perilous journey, but Ryosen did not hesitate. The next day, at sunrise, he set out. Ryosen left at dawn with only a simple backpack and a scroll tucked close to his chest. Mount Koya was many leagues away, and the path would not be easy, but within him there was something even heavier than his baggage: doubt. What did Kōbō Daishi mean? What did he need to abandon? The more he thought, the more the questions seemed to multiply. The trail was grueling: steep climbs, dense forests, treacherous rivers. But it wasn't just fatigue that tested his determination. It was the people he encountered along the way. Each of them carried their own pain and unknowingly offered him clues about the mystery he was trying to unravel. The first was an elderly merchant sitting by the side of the road, counting silver coins with an anxious look. "I work day and night, but it's never enough," he lamented. "If only I had just a little more, I would finally rest." But Ryosen realized that despite the fortune around him, he was never satisfied. Further along, he met a young warrior with eyes shadowed by guilt. "I was trained to protect," he said, looking down at his hands, "but I've taken so many lives, and those memories won't let me be at peace." Though no one else could see it, Ryosen felt that he still bore the weight of every sword he had raised in the past. On the third day of his journey, Ryosen came across an elderly woman standing before an ancient gravestone. The name had long faded due to rain and time, but her tears were fresh. "My son left 20 years ago," she whispered, "and yet I can't let him go." Her gaze was not on the present, but lost in a past that would never allow her to move forward. After leaving the woman behind, Ryozan paused to reflect. 3 people, 3 stories, 3 forms of suffering. But what made them unhappy was not money, guilt, or loss itself. It was something deeper, something everyone seemed to refuse to abandon. It was then that a troubling thought crossed his mind. What if the true meaning of Kōbō Daishi's warning had been right in front of him all along? What if what he needed to abandon wasn't something external, but something within himself? Still without answers, but with his heart more alert than ever, he continued his journey. Mount Koya was getting closer, and with it, the truth that could change his life forever. After days of walking, Ryozan finally reached Mount Koya. The air was colder there, and a sacred silence hung over the ancient temples. But before he could seek answers, an old monk warned him, "Before you find what you seek, you will need to pass 3 tests." The first test took him to a bronze mirror hidden in the heart of a forgotten sanctuary. As he gazed into it, he saw his own reflection. But something was wrong. His image began to distort, revealing different versions of himself. A proud Ryozan, a fearful Ryozan, a Ryozan consumed by doubt. He tried to look away, but the monk's voice echoed in his mind, "Look closely. This is your true enemy." The second test brought him to a steep cliff where a massive stone awaited him. His task was simple: carry it to the top. At first, it seemed manageable, but with each step, the weight became unbearable. Just as his knees were about to give in, understanding struck him. This stone was not just a physical burden, it was the invisible weight he carried in his soul. Fears, regrets, expectations. All of this was trapped within that rock. But what if he simply let it go? The third test was the most challenging. Ryozan was taken to an empty room where he was told to wait. Time passed. Minutes turned into hours, until the door finally opened and someone entered. The moment he saw that person's face, his heart raced. It was someone he hadn't seen in years, someone he despised. His chest filled with resentment. Harsh words wanted to escape his mouth. But then he remembered the mirror. He remembered the stone. He remembered that the true burden lay not in the other, but within himself. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time released the hatred he had held for so long. When he opened his eyes, the room was empty. The monk appeared and smiled. Ryozan had passed the final test. But instead of satisfaction, he felt a strange emptiness, as if something inside him was disappearing. And perhaps that was the true purpose of those tests. If he wanted to find Kōbō Daishi's answer first, he needed to learn to abandon that which prevented him from seeing it. The path was still far from over. But at that moment, Ryozan realized he was no longer the same monk who had begun the journey. At the top of Mount Koya, beyond the temples and the trails hidden by mist, there was a sanctuary where few arrived. It was there that Master Kogen lived, one of the last guardians of Kōbō Daishi's most secret teachings. Ryozan approached him with a racing heart. Now finally, he would have the answer he had sought for so long. The master observed him in silence for a long time, as if seeing something beyond what the eyes could perceive. Then he spoke only one sentence. "What you want to know is already within you." Ryozan felt a chill run down his spine. Had his journey been in vain? Did all those trials lead him to no clear answer? With a mix of frustration and despair, he pulled the scroll from his chest and extended it to the master. "If Kōbō Daishi left this warning, then there's something we need to abandon. What is this?" Master Kogen gently took the scroll, read the faded message, and smiled as if he already knew what was written. Then he looked at Ryozan and said, "What makes the merchant suffer is not the lack of money, but greed. What torments the warrior is not the battles, but his guilt. What makes the woman weep is not the loss of her son, but her refusal to accept impermanence." Ryozan held his breath. It was it. It had been it all along. The this that condemns us to unhappiness is attachment. Suddenly, everything became clear. The old merchant couldn't let go of his obsession with wealth. The warrior couldn't release his past. The elderly woman couldn't free herself from the pain of loss. And what about him? What was he still holding on to? But before he could answer, the master continued, "The real question is not, what must you abandon, but why are you still holding on?" This revelation struck him like lightning. And from that moment on, Ryozan knew his journey was far from finished. Ryozan felt his chest tighten. Attachment. That word echoed in his mind like an endless refrain. Could this really be the root of all suffering? He thought of the merchant, the warrior, the elderly woman. He thought of himself, of everything he still clung to. Before he could speak, Master Kogen continued, "Suffering does not come from what we lose, but from our refusal to let go." Then he pointed to a leaf gently falling from a nearby tree. "Look, the leaves do not weep as they fall. They simply accept the flow of life." Ryozan fell silent. And what about him? He had clung to the quest for an answer, to the desire to find greater meaning. What if all this time he had been grasping something he needed to release? The master approached and calmly said, "The problem does not lie in the things you possess or the people you love. The problem is the fear of losing them. It's in the need for control, in the desire for everything to last forever." Ryozan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Attachment was not just to material things, it was to the past, to expectations, to the identity he thought he needed to have. He had always believed that happiness was in finding something, but now he realized that perhaps it was, in fact, in letting go of everything. Master Kogen smiled, noticing the change in his gaze. Water flows because it does not cling to the river. The wind blows because it does not hold on to the mountains. And the spirit finds peace when it learns to release all that imprisons it. Ryozan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of Kōbō Daishi's warning, but understanding wasn't enough. He knew he needed to take the next step. There was still something within him that held him back. And to truly be free, he would have to make a difficult decision. That night, Ryozan couldn't sleep. If attachment was the true cause of suffering, then what still kept him bound? He had traveled to Mount Koya in search of answers, faced tests, and met people who reflected his own fears. But now, he needed to look within. In the morning, he made a decision. If he wanted to be free, he needed to let go of everything. Without hesitation, he removed his monk's robes and placed them before Master Kogen. Those clothes represented everything he believed he was. His identity, his journey, his relentless pursuit of something greater. But what if he wasn't any of that? What if he had always defined himself by things that, deep down, never belonged to him? The master watched in silence. He knew that Ryozan was not merely relinquishing a piece of fabric. He was letting go of the need to be someone. For the first time, Ryozan felt the cool wind touch his skin without the layers of who he thought he was. He was no longer a monk. He was no longer a seeker. He was nothing anymore. And instead of fear, he felt something unexpected, lightness. For months, he wandered aimlessly through Japan. There was no destination to reach anymore. There were no more answers to seek. Just the present, flowing like a river without banks. Along the way, he encountered people like the merchant, the warrior, and the elderly woman. But now, he offered them no teachings. He simply listened. He was just present. And little by little, he realized something extraordinary. When we release what holds us back, we do not become empty. On the contrary, we become infinite. In that moment, Ryozan understood the freedom Kōbō Daishi spoke of was never far away. It had always been there, waiting for him to have the courage to let go. Years passed. Ryozan never returned to the temple, never took up his name as a monk again, never sought answers anymore. But strangely, he never needed to. Traveling from village to village, he helped those he encountered along the way. Sometimes he worked in the fields. Other times, he simply listened to stories from strangers. He didn't try to change anyone. He didn't try to teach anything. He was just present. And that's how he noticed a secret that so many people go their entire lives without realizing. No one needs to achieve anything to be happy. True peace does not lie in finding something. but in letting go of all that prevents us from feeling what is already here. For all his life, Ryozen thought happiness was like a distant destination, something to be conquered. But in the end, he realized it had always been in the only place he had never searched, the present. There at Mount Koya, Kōbō Daishi's warning still echoed. If you do not abandon this, you will be unhappy forever. But now, Ryozen knew the message was never about giving up the world. It was about giving up control. Attachment is what makes us suffer. Attachment to the past. Attachment to the future. Attachment to who we think we should be. But life flows, and when we stop trying to hold on to it, something magical happens. It carries us with ease. And now, I ask you, what are you still holding on to? What inside you prevents you from simply being here now? Perhaps it's time to let go, because on the other side of detachment lies freedom. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more teachings that could transform your life. And remember, the key to freedom is in your hands. Are you ready to let go?